Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the GrainTALK webinar. Today, we'll be discussing the learnings of 2020 to date. What a year it's been. Joining us today is Joanne Follings, the cereal specialist, Ben Rosser, the corn specialist, Horst Bohner, the soybean specialist with the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs. Welcome, everybody. I'm glad you're able to join us. And when we look back at the spring of 2020, we can remember average April temperatures seemed like an average kind of April. It looked like we're setting up for an average spring. We had a good window for planting of spring cereals in April, a smaller planting window for corn, and a smaller number of soybean fields did get planted. So Horst could talk a little bit about kind of the experiments that happened at that time. But then all of a sudden, May happened. And the first part of May, the first 10 days, is typically when we plant in Ontario our corn and soybean crop. And it brought us a window of opportunity that many growers at that time would have said it was a much better planting conditions than in 2019 ever had. But unfortunately, May turned a little bit further than normal. Actually, I think there was a lot of crops that had snow right after they got planted. And then we had some freezing temperatures and cold rain after that. And soil temperatures were reduced drastically. And that was right before the real germination could occur. So a lot of seed took in some cold water at the time. So I'm sure we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about that today. But once the May weather broke, and it was about after May 20th that much of the planting resumed and the crops started to emerge by the end of the month. What a spring it was. So we're going to talk a little bit today, hopefully understanding what the conditions were, what we maybe could have done differently, or maybe what we have to expect and what we can plan for in the future. But I was kind of wondering with our three specialists that we have here today, what impacts did the crop have from spring weather? I don't know, Joanna, did you want to kick it off and your thoughts on what impacts we had from the spring weather?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, as you mentioned, we did have quite this spring. Things were fairly nice and warm in that late March, early April timeframe. And for some, or for many growers, it actually provided a really good window of opportunity to get spring cereals planted much earlier than we had done the year prior. So we're targeting that mid to late April in southern and central Ontario and early May for northern Ontario. And there was a really big push in that nice open window early on to get those spring cereals seeded much earlier than we did the year prior. So that was really good. We also saw nitrogen going on early in April to promote tillering, particularly in those fields that had been planted late the previous fall. So there was a really good, window there, and we were getting pretty excited. But then, yeah, we did then run into some cooler temperatures, particularly in later April and early part of May. And we've got wheat fields or spring cereal and winter cereal fields that actually saw snow the week of I think it was around May 11th. So that did slow growth and did slow things down quite significantly in many regions. And there was actually some concerns about nighttime temperatures and how that could impact the crop. And what we, thankfully in that instance, the crop wasn't advanced for the most part. And so it could really withstand those cooler temperatures. But what we really did see, or where we did see an impact rather, was really on the overall growth and root growth in particular. So those cold temperatures meant we were kind of limited on that root growth, which in some cases limited our access to other nutrients. And this was particularly prominent in those fields that didn't see a starter last fall. So that, made those fields a little bit more predisposed to cold injury as well as other nutrient deficiencies. So we were seeing things like manganese, boron, magnesium deficiencies. And again, we were seeing it more so in those fields that didn't have that starter because they were more predisposed from those cooler temperatures. But from there, and then I guess we also did see some cold injury in some of the spring cereals, and what that looked like was really just yellowing of the leaf tips, and it grew out of it for the most part. The cooler temperatures from a crop impact also meant we kind of shortened up that stem elongation period, or I should say we saw less stem elongation, and so we did see a little bit of a shorter crop. But we did have lots of tillering for the most part, and it did enable for more tillering. So it still meant that straw yields were quite reasonable at the end of the day, because we did have some pretty good tillering there. The temperatures also made it a bit of a challenge to get those herbicides applied. So we did have to, wait to get those applications in. And when we could finally go, the window of application was quite tight. So it did bring some curveballs to us, but I think for the most part, growers navigated things quite well. And yeah, I guess we'll leave it at that for now.
No, good points, Joanna. I think I remember, yeah, there's probably some applications that didn't occur because our timing was so off on herbicide or fungicide. Some people had missed some periods of time. Do you think that impacted the crop at all? Any missed herbicide applications or missed fungicide? Did it have any impact on it?
Yeah, so we did, and we can touch on this a little bit more too in a little bit here, but we definitely did see some growers just opt not to apply herbicides altogether, simply because that window was so small. And once that flag leaf was out, we really didn't want to cause any injury or risk causing injury to that flag leaf. And because of the cooler temperatures too, we saw those weeds taking a little bit longer to get going, those annuals to come up. And I think that crop canopy was thick enough to kind of keep those weeds at bay. And so growers decided to opt out of the herbicides and rather try to, scout for disease and time their fungicides more appropriately, or wait for a PGR application. The other curveball, I guess, that was thrown in, and I should let Tracy maybe comment on this sometime, but we had a very wacky spring, and we saw, as a result of that, a lot of insects this year that we wouldn't typically see. So we had all of them. We had aphids, we had cereal leaf beetle, we had armyworm, and in some cases we had all three insect pests in a field. So that was also something that was a little bit different this year. And I don't know if that's just the cold temperatures, but definitely saw a lot more insect pressure this year than what we have seen in the past.
Yeah, and a shout out to, I think, everybody in agriculture who kind of like rallied around when issues were happening in the field. There's lots of great communication that went out. All the crop advisors, retails, all the extension staff, everybody kind of pulled together today or this past year, and things were happening.
Yeah.
The communication went out really good, so farmers were aware of it, and activity and action happened in the field, so it was good. Okay, moving on to soybeans. So just wondering, Horst, kind of the spring, what did that do this year in soybeans? Getting that established.
Well, I think the key question growers have is that once you move into the second half of April and the first part of May, if soil conditions are fit, do you wait, right? Do you wait for the temperature to be right? Do you wait for some other reason in terms of when they flower with maturity and those kind of questions? And so I think it is a legitimate question, especially when you think about getting all the corn planted, right? Do you want to get to that job done first, or should you be really ramming the soybeans in at the same time? And so I think what we learned this year, again, at least in terms of that temperature, soil temperature question, is that really soybeans are much tougher than we give them credit for, right? And we talk about that imbibitional chilling injury, that first bit of cold water. Does that really impact them in terms of both germination, emergence, and then early season growth or vigor? And at the end of the day, I guess really what you come back to when you look at the trials is that, and I was at some trials yesterday, again, is trying to assess whether there was any damage from beans that we planted in very cold conditions, right? 3 degrees Celsius, went to -3 that night, and we have a number of sites like that. And at the end of the day, I can just tell you that the stand is there, and they are potted up very nicely. So we can put that behind us. I think I'm not concerned about soil temperature as a general statement anymore when it comes to when to plant soybeans. There's still that question of, should you plant your corn first from, a logistics standpoint, but I'm amazed how tough soybeans are. I think we can pretty much put a nail in that coffin in terms of should we really worry about planting if it's 5 degrees Celsius, right, kind of thing.
So those April planted fields in Horst, you never really lost those fields. They didn't have to be replanted. They were still there. Populations were still good enough. You kept them. So really no loss in that April planted.
Yeah, I guess that's another way to look at it. Even if there's no gain, when you think about wheat, right, in terms of when we're going to get those soybeans off so you can get that wheat in earlier, yeah, for sure. Certainly, the ones I was following, there was a bit of a reduced stand in some places, but because the beans got in early, they had more time to bush, and so they fill out anyway. Now, having said that, though, I mean, I still, when I look at the overall picture, there has to be some conversation about residue management. Because if you are no-tilling into a thick corn mat very early, that can be a pretty ugly situation, right?
And that's why the growers that couldn't plant early, right? They were waiting for those fields to dry off and just couldn't get in there. It wasn't fit, so they didn't go in.
Oh, yeah, no. And again, we always come back to that stand that soybeans or the ground has to be fit to plant soybeans, right? Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And actually, probably some of the lower populations of wheat plants that happened on soybeans were probably the fields planted maybe early or mid-May, and it was all based on heavy rains, crusting. There was other conditions. It wasn't just April planted or it was cold soil temperature. It was other things that affected it.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head, right? Just because you plant May 20th doesn't guarantee you're going to have a better stand than planting April 25th, for sure. So, I mean, if I was to characterize it in terms of, you know, whether you should plant April 25th, with the experience that we went through so far this year. Now, we haven't got them to yield yet, right? So let's see what happens in the end. But I would say no hesitation. If the ground is fit, plant early, and there is some benefit there, right? And just as a final thought on that, you know, when we had similar conditions in 2010, and we did planting date studies, we had a 10 bushel advantage to planting early versus late with the right variety. So it can turn out that way, right?
Yeah. Thanks, Horst. So on the corn side, Ben, any thoughts on what happened this spring to the corn crop as it got planted during that week period of May?
Yeah, so I kind of echo Horst's comments. You know, things were relatively dry through April, still maybe on the cooler side. And I think that question came up. But certainly towards the end of April and that first week of May, you know, a lot of corn was going in. Of course, we all saw in the forecast that kind of May 8th to May 11th period where things, you know, there was, depending where you are in the province, there was snow in the forecast, low temperatures well below zero. So the big question comes up, you know, how close to that do you plant? There's the traditional wisdom, you know, you try to avoid planting, you know, a day or two ahead of that cold weather so you don't take that first germination or soaking moisture up with that seed. That's that cold weather. So that was a big question. So I know a lot of people had said, you know, maybe that Wednesday or the Thursday they would stop planting. I think it was, a lot of people were surprised in the day once stuff started to come up that even some of that stuff that was pushed, generally speaking, didn't look too terrible and still came through it. You know, I think there was exceptions of fields where there were some issues from stuff that was planted into there, but there were also cases where guys had pushed things and things turned out okay too. I think one thing that was maybe a little bit different is that, you know, at the beginning of that really cold period, we still stayed relatively dry. So even here around Allure, we had some snow on that Saturday. It was the May 9th. And by the time that snow burned off, we were still just as dry and normal and not crazy warm below, but cold and dry down below too is what we were before we got that snow. But I know eventually we did get some more snow and some cold rains in that, you know, I think it was a Sunday and the Monday, the 10th and 11th. I know just looking for a couple fields around Allure, you know, again, there was the odd one where there was some of the late stuff planted had maybe had some stand issues, likely from that cold weather. But again, fields that seemed okay. From a couple fields I had walked with some seed dealers and agronomists, I think one thing that really jumped out was differences in hybrids. So guys that did try to push things up close to that cold weather, stuff that is known to maybe be a little sensitive to cold temperatures, it did show in terms of stand loss, but stuff that didn't seem as bad. So maybe one learning point going forwards from this spring.
Yeah, I think crop insurance made some reports back in the springtime. I can't remember the exact number, but there was probably about 20 or 30,000 acres of corn that was replanted. Most of it, I think, in southwestern Ontario.
Yeah.
Cold conditions, and it was all that May 6th, 8th planting really got hit hard.
Yeah, and even like in some of the fields I was in too, you wonder whether it was just purely a cold thing, or in some cases just ground conditions as well, getting the corn out of the ground. So yeah, I think by and large things weren't maybe hit as much as what you'd think, given planting corn into those types of conditions.
Yeah, yeah. And Horst, with the replant too, I think crop insurance, I'm trying to think what their number, maybe something like 40,000 acres was replanted in the springtime that I recall, but that's probably, considering some years, that's probably average.
Yes, yeah, for sure. We expect fairly, compared to other crops, a fairly large number of acres that get replanted every year on those clays, right? It's just tough if you get one
rainfall.
Yeah, exactly. Right. What do you do? Right?
Yeah. So once that cold period, we saw the forecast happen in May 1st. Horst, you touched on it a bit. Would we do anything differently next time? So if we saw the weather forecast, it was going to be cold for 2 weeks, snow was coming in, would you change anything? Maybe I'll send it over to Ben. What are your thoughts? Would you make any changes? Would you say, hey, we should have stopped earlier? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it always depends on what the year brings. Like, again, there was calls maybe stop a couple days ahead, but other guys who just continued to plant and turn out okay. I think one thing that was unique about our cold again was that we stayed relatively dry, and we were dry to start with going into the cold. So if you had exact conditions like that, things seemed okay. But of course, I think it depends a bit on the year. I think one thing that stood out again in a couple of fields that I had looked at, and some hybrid plots and stuff I had walked with some dealers and agronomists, was that again, some of those hybrids that are just known to struggle in colder conditions, it did show up in some of those fields. So the comments they had made was, if we see conditions like this again, maybe not try to get everything in ahead of that cold weather. If we've got some hybrids we know are more susceptible, maybe just leave them at least in the shed, put the stuff we're pretty confident in the ground, and maybe leave that stuff once that cold weather has passed. Just hedge our bets a little bit.
Yeah. Horst, did you have any thoughts?
Well, I think again, if you could, if we had a good, accurate, long-term forecast, you could pick your day, right? And so always this question comes up of, would you do things differently? Yeah. If I had known what the next 2 weeks were going to do, of course, I'd pick my absolute best 2-3 days. But the way that works in our industry is, basically, I have come to the decision that if the ground is fit and the calendar is, in that last part of April, you drive, right? You plant and you plant and you plant until you're finished. That's kind of where my head is at, because the problem in Ontario is some years when it starts to rain, it doesn't stop for a month, right? And so you can always after the fact wonder if you did the right thing, but on average, I think you just drive, right? The other point I would just like to make is that one thing that I have really come to in terms of soybeans is that when you have a big corn crop ahead of those beans, right? 200 bushels is considered fairly normal now for a lot of growers. To straight no-till into that without thinking about residue management, we got to get past that. If we're going to grow big soybean crops, we need to control or deal with that residue, in some way, whether that's a bit of pre-tillage, whether that's row cleaners to push it out of the way, but some sort of a package to get the row clear of residue. I think we have to get there, right? That's my thinking.
I think a lot of growers struggle with that root ball, It's that zone around that corn root stays so wet, and it's hard getting those beans in there. So planting on an angle, doing something different.
Yeah. Yep.
Joanna, do you see anything as far as the spring? Hindsight's 2020. Is there something we should have done different with our nitrogen application based on what happened?
Yeah, so I would like to position it more about what we can do to prepare for a situation like that again. And so the first thing that comes to my mind in thinking about that is making sure that we're putting a phosphorus starter down with our crop at seeding. And this is something we can think about right now, and something that we should be doing right now as we're getting ready to seed this fall. That starter pea, we know wheat or cereals are so responsive, but it really, really helps with that root growth and development and exploration, which was really evident or important rather this past spring, especially when it came to accessing some of those nutrients during those cold temperatures. So I would say that, if we run into a situation like this again, we did find that the impact of some of those nutrient deficiencies seemed to be lessened in those fields where our starter was used, because they were a little bit less predisposed to those cold conditions and able to access those nutrients. But without that root growth, we could run into some of those issues again. So that would definitely be one thing. The other thing, and we talked a little bit about this with regards to herbicide applications. So we really ran into a situation where it was tough to make those applications. If we were going early, the annual weeds weren't even there yet. And then it started to get too late and we were starting to run into issues with the wind. It was so windy every day to try to go and make an application. And then the flag leaf was emerging. So again, this is something that we have control over now and this fall. And so I think that the takeaway here is that we need to try and time that right this fall, and especially if we run into a situation where we have to hold off those applications or we run into cool conditions. And like I said, there were some growers that opted to not even spray a herbicide anymore. But if we make those fall applications, we can get some of those winter annuals. We can get some of those fleabane when they're much smaller rosettes as opposed to in the spring when they start to get bigger and bolt. So fall herbicide applications and starter is definitely something that came to my mind from what we experienced in the spring. And the other funky thing that we were seeing was related to sulfur. We have less atmospheric deposition, but when we do see that crop demand in the wheat, it tends to be a little bit cooler still. We don't have a lot of that mineralization kicking in the soil yet. So although we were applying our sulfur in that early application, it really depended on the form that we were applying. And in some instances, particularly with ammonium thiosulfate, that is not totally plant available. And so that took some time for that to mineralize and become available to the crop. And so it's tough to say because you don't really know what the forecast is going to say, but perhaps in those situations, ammonium sulfate would have been a better choice than ammonium thiosulfate, just to make sure that it's there and available for that crop.
Oh, good points. Good points. So, Joanna, when we saw June kind of come, all of a sudden it got a little bit warmer, really warmer. And in a lot of the areas of the province, I know in the east, it's an extremely dry spring for them in the east. And down in parts of southwestern Ontario, it's extremely dry on the wheat crop as well. What's your thoughts and what impact did June have on it?
Yeah, so going into June, things started to warm up. They looked fairly good, but then near the second half of June, we really started to see those temperatures climb. And I know it was the first week of July, right around when we have our typical crop diagnostic days, never fails. We saw 7 or 8 days over 30 degrees Celsius, particularly in southern Ontario. And so what that does is it speeds up that grain fill period. So rather than having, nice cool temperatures or, moderate temperatures, we got really hot temperatures. And that took our grain fill period and shortened it quite a bit. And so because of that, we were seeing probably we were seeing lower test weights and also likely had an impact on our yield overall. While we still did have a pretty good crop, we definitely saw an impact from those hot, dry temperatures. On the flip side, those hot, dry temperatures were great in terms of quality. We had, very, very minimal fusarium in the province. There's very little wheat that was downgraded because of fusarium. We saw some really great high falling numbers. And we also, we saw good quality early on, but as that crop stayed in the field, in some areas it did start to weather, and so we saw that quality start to drop off. But for the most part, like I said, the weather was actually perfect from a quality standpoint, but absolutely that shortened that grain fill period and definitely had an impact on our test weights and our yields overall.
Yeah, for a lot of growers, it was like just a beautiful crop because we had a perfect spring for it. It got in the ground last fall, a lot better than the year before. It was just perfect. And it took a little bit off the top on their yield. I mean, still, I think they were happily surprised at where the yields ended up. But I mean, with some rain in June, it would have been so much better.
Absolutely. And I think, I commend growers because they never gave up on the crop despite everything that we threw out at this spring, the weather, the nutrient deficiencies, the insects. Growers really stuck with it, managed the crop right through to the end. And I think everyone was still reasonably happy with their yields, as opposed to we maybe had, took our foot off the gas a little bit. We might have seen some lower yields, but I think we managed it through to the end, and I think it paid off in the end.
So as far as, amount of nitrogen applied, do you have any recommendations or thoughts regarding, growers that used higher or lower, or what kind of worked this year?
Yeah, for sure. So nitrogen was definitely interesting. There was talk early on about cutting back on some of those nitrogen rates, but because we felt we had such good yield potential there, and we really didn't know what June was going to bring, we really didn't cut back on those nitrogen rates. And I think that's also partially why we're seeing high protein levels, because we still pushed on that nitrogen. But that 120 and 130 pounds seemed to be that sort of ideal range. Once we started getting into that 150 and 160, and I'm talking about soft red wheat in particular, we didn't really see that, nice yield response that we would like to see, that we will typically get that we will get on other years. So really those extremely high rates of nitrogen, we didn't see that huge yield advantage. And, again, that's to the fact that we did run into some of those hot, dry conditions. And really, we had quite minimal losses of nitrogen this year. So that 120 and 130 pounds really was sufficient at the end of the day.
Yeah, it did the trick. Yeah. Ben, just kind of wonder about the corn crop in June. We got some dry weather there, put the roots down. What did you find with the nitrogen sampling that you did, and what growers were putting on, and what kind of work for them this year?
Yeah, so every year, kind of early, mid-June, we try to do a nitrate survey. GFO supports it, just to get an idea of what levels are like. Gives you a bit of an idea year to year in terms, are things high? Are they higher than normal looking? I think there's the expectation that, given things have been so cool coming into June, that maybe mineralization would be delayed somewhat. Just because of the cool conditions. When we did our survey across the province, it was kind of interesting that things were kind of normal, maybe even slightly above normal from an average nitrate perspective. So we maybe weren't quite expecting that. If you think about it, we really didn't have any significant rain events in terms of losing nitrogen. So maybe it's not surprising that we weren't low from a loss perspective. But it was interesting that, mineralization did seem to be able to still kick out nitrogen, kind of what we would normally see across the province. So that's the question too, in terms of splits and that sort of thing. If you look at the spring we had up until June, there was soil moisture there. There was, but we didn't get any significant rainfall. So I don't think we would expect to see a big yield response to trying to split nitrogen in a year like 2020. But again, you don't know till you take yields, but just given the way weather turned out, that would be an expectation anyways.
With that dry weather, did you see any difference in the banding? I know you've done some banding trials and some work with growers on banding fertilizer fall and the spring. Did you see any differences this year? Or
we've got some strip till trials out where we've looked at that. Personally, nothing jumped out this spring. I know last spring our spring strips with fertility really jumped out compared to our other treatments. But nothing visual anyways in the trials this year. And we'll have to see what yields say at the end of the year, of course.
Yeah, until harvest, we really don't have the numbers, so we don't know yet.
Yeah.
For sure. Horst, what was your experience in June with that drier weather? What did you see on soybeans?
Well, when it's so dry, of course, you're just desperately trying to get that little seed out of the ground, and the first part of June we're struggling with some of those plant stands, right? Especially on the heavy clays. But as we learned in 2018, an early dry start, and you hit on it a little bit already, Marty, it's actually a positive thing for a lot of these crops, in the sense that you push the roots down. And because soybeans are so sensitive to these different root pathogens, right? We've got a whole root rot complex that usually sets in to some level in a lot of fields in Ontario. When we have dry conditions, often we have less of that. We might have some fusarium wilt and other issues, but on the whole, there's a lot less root rot. And so that's a very positive thing for later on. You're setting yourself up for better yield. So I would say that, that dry window was really a positive thing in the long term. And that's what we're seeing now when we look at the beans and the pod count. I think it's tied together, right? Things look quite promising right now.
Yeah, it's kind of nice to have some rainfall during the grain fill period. It sure is. Are there any special projects or other things that any of you are working on that you want to share with the group? Anything that you've seen this year?
Well, I'll just throw one thing out there that I'm kind of excited about in our big fertility project, where we're really trying to grow 100 bushel soybeans, right? When you have that rain in August, like we had this year, like some of us had over 5 inches in the month of August, and it was in 3 nice little windows, kind of the beginning, middle, and end of August. And personally, last night here we had another terrific rain, and it's just in time. The leaves are still green. We can still use that to size up the seed. If you have the nutrients, the thing you got to remember about soybeans is, of course, the majority of the roots are in the top 3-4 inches, probably as much as 80% in many of our soil types. And so, of course, as that seed grows and all those nutrients are necessary, if it's dry in August, you don't have the yield, right? And we all know that about soybeans. But the reason for it is at least partly simply nutrient availability, right? And so then, of course, when you have fed the soybean crop earlier in the year with fertilizer and you get the rain, you just get quite a response. So all that to say, I'm quite excited about our high yield trials, and I think we're going to have some really exciting numbers in places where it rained and we fed those beans. Yeah.
Because it was dry earlier, Horst, I'm wondering, any white mold issues with the rains that came in July? Have you seen any? I haven't seen any in my travels, but just wondered if there's any out there.
I'm sure there's a few fields here and there. There always are. But personally, no, I'm with you. I wouldn't even know right now where to find a field with white mold in my geography. But of course, it's such a big disease across the province. I'm sure there's pockets here and there. But generally speaking, yeah, that was not our issue this year. And of course, again, dry early on and hot, both of those are not conducive to white mold. But I think that, the one thing that we maybe have underestimated is the amount of damage that those spider mites have caused, right? And because it often just looks like a bit of drought damage, and then if you're not familiar with them, you might ignore it. I bet you, certainly in this area, there was a lot more damage than we thought there was. And the problem with it is, even the products that we spray with, to be honest, they're not that good on mites. And so you get these, you calm the numbers down for a while, and then they blow up again if conditions are bad. And I know in Eastern Ontario, and it's often a double whammy: dry, because that's what those critters want, and then you get the mites on top of it, and they can really take the top off a crop.
One other thing I've seen with some dead plants out there in the field is Phytophthora. So areas that got the heavy rainfall, like big 4-inch rain or something, Phytophthora came in like middle of the season. Typically we see it earlier on the clays, but this year with that rain, to get the soil and move stuff around, Phytophthora really started to come out.
No, those are fair comments. And that fusarium wilt was quite widespread further north too. And then we did have, and we'll have some Phomopsis seed decay as well, right? And we'll have some purple seed stain in the fall here. With those rains, you get those later season problems. But overall, I think the crop is pretty much made, and it looks pretty decent today. In fact, when we look at the pod number and the pod counts, some of the growers I talk to say that they expect the best crop they've ever had, right? And so across the province, when you put it all together, I think this will be one of the best crops we've had, barring that something unforeseen doesn't happen, obviously, over the next month or so.
No.
But no, a lot of us are quite happy with how things look, and we hope for a really positive harvest, right?
Any special management for fall harvest for growers when they're thinking about their soybean harvest? You mentioned about maybe some pods and maybe some of the beans you got to be careful of. Any concerns that you're thinking right now?
Well, I mean, the obvious one that comes to mind is the whole issue of weed control, right? When it was so dry early on, a lot of these fields aren't as clean as we'd like. The herbicides had a tough time, and we had to spray again, and now we've got that flush of weeds that have come through. So a pre-harvest desiccant, I think, would be very helpful in some of those fields. And so, of course, you got to think about pre-harvest interval. Who's receiving your beans? What products are you allowed to use? Because, of course, glyphosate is a great product in terms of what it can do in the fall, especially getting us ready for wheat. But a lot of us aren't allowed to use it if they're IP beans or wherever the beans are going. So there's a few things to think about. But as a general statement, I would say if the field is weedy and going to wheat, for sure, pre-harvest burn down goes a long way.
Yeah. Moving over to corn, Ben, I'm just wondering, have you seen much as far as the crop out there? Any diseases showing up? I know dawn and gibberella ear rot's always a concern. Everybody asks every summertime, but we never know a little bit later on. But any words of advice out there that you have already?
Yeah, so I haven't had a good chance to travel lots of fields across, but a few I've been in, even though we've had some good rains, starting in August from tassel timing on, at least the fields I've been in, I haven't seen a lot from a leaf disease perspective. Looking in ears, I've seen a little bit of ear molds. They're there. I wouldn't say they're high or anything like that, but I have seen a little bit of that. But we do plan on doing our survey we do every year, probably given where the crop's at, maybe the last 7-10 days of September is kind of where we'd be aiming for that. So we'll get a better snapshot when we do that across the province. But certainly in the fields that I have been in, things don't look crazy by any means.
Yeah, what I've seen so far, there's been a lot of areas where we had that dry weather earlier. The husk cover is short. The tips are kind of exposed. So, you can think about, well, maybe exposed tips, you get more insect feeding, maybe a little bit more mold. But I don't think the gibberella ear rot should be that much of a concern just because the way the season's set up for us. But,
yeah.
We really don't know until we do the survey and we get out there in September, because really it gets infected in July and really it progresses through August and it develops at that time. So you can't really measure it until later. No offense. And stock strength looks good, I think, because of the drier weather. The stock's set up pretty good. So we're nothing like Iowa. We're actually sitting pretty good with corn, I think.
Yeah.
We're doing okay. Joanna, any thoughts on getting set up for planting for winter wheat?
Yeah, so actually, one of the things I would suggest at this time of year is actually going out and taking note of your soybean fields, taking note, seeing which, what worked in terms of planting, but also which varieties work well in terms of allowing you to get wheat in the rotation in a timely fashion. So, Horst and I talk about this a lot. And I think right now is a really good time to go out and start making those notes to find out or identify those fields that you can get off first and get wheat planted into early. Also think about, your combine settings and how that trash and residue is going to be spreading, especially in those fields that are going to go to winter wheat. Now is the time to, make sure that we have all those settings properly, because we don't want to see that trash becoming an issue when we go into seed our wheat and in terms of emergence. And then, really the other things are watch your planting dates. We want to target as close to our optimum planting date as we can, making sure that, we are using a starter phosphorus containing starter to ensure that crop is, nice and even emergence, but also to help promote that early root growth and development. And we're really targeting at least 2 to 3 good tillers this fall. So the earlier we can get that crop planted, still when we are accumulating, sufficient amount of growing degree days, this is the time to make sure that we get that crop in the ground. And then again, just to, as Horst touched on, trying, if you are able to do that fall weed control either prior to winter wheat planting or shortly thereafter to ensure that you don't have to deal with that this coming spring. And so, yeah, those would be the main points.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thanks very much for your time. I think it was a great session. Greatly appreciate the information you provided for growers about thinking about this past year and how we can maybe apply certain things we learned for our future crops that we're going to grow. So thanks very much, Joanna, Ben, and Horst. Let me say that again. Hopefully we can do a little edit there. Thanks, Joanna, Ben, and Horst. Greatly appreciate your time today.
Thanks
for having us.
Marty.
So, hey,